All right. If you weren't here last week, you're off the hook for a minute. If you were here last week, what was going on in the first part of chapter 4?
He emphasized that you cannot serve God and the world. He said to draw near to God and the devil or Satan will flee from you, and submit to God and resist the devil.
Mm-hmm. Why can you not be friends with God and friends with the world at the same time? I mean, there are a whole lot of Christians trying to do that. Why can't you?
Because they're at odds with each other.
That's right. They're at odds with each other. The wisdom of the world is at odds with the wisdom of God. The morality of the world is at odds with the morality of God. The character of the world is at odds with the character of God. You can't, if you try to divide yourself that way and to be friends with both at the same time, it doesn't work. And not only does it not work, but you remember James started that bit by saying, "You adulterous people." like it's a serious kind of division, because to be friends with the world is to be an enemy of God. Yes. So he said, submit yourselves to God, resist the devil. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I like what you said, that the wisdom of God is characterized by peace, which produces a harvest of righteousness. In contrast to the wisdom of the world, is characterized by bitter envy, selfish ambition, which produces disorder and chaos.
Mm-hmm. And we saw that last week with the fighting, the quarreling, all that kind of stuff. That's a direct result of the wisdom of the world. Yep. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay, let's look at the section that comes next. We're going to read chapter 4, verse 13 through chapter 5, verse 6. So James 4:13. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. Oh, there's always some drama, isn't there? Yeah. So, what's the issue that James addresses in verse 13?
He is concerned with those who are busy working, traveling, making a profit. They are driven not by God, but the world's goals.
Mm-hmm. So he's coming back to people of means, and the reason I think they're people of means is because if they're going to some city and staying a year and doing business and making money, they're obviously not poor people just looking for an opportunity to get a better life. These are people who have the means to do what they like, and they're making the most of it. But wealth, you're right, Donna, wealth is not the issue here, and neither is the fact that they're making big plans. What's the issue? Yeah, it's pride, isn't it? It's the assumption of self-sovereignty and the pride that's underneath it. Now that's not unrelated to wealth, because wealth tends to be a God replacement that gives people the illusion of autonomy and self-determination, but pride is the problem. Or let's put a modern day spin on it. Have you ever heard that poem that ends, "I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul"? That's the American worldview in a nutshell, isn't it? Like, we determine exactly who we are, where we go, what we do, what life is like. We're the ones who are in control. Or I saw this meme the other day on the internet that said, it's true that time flies, but remember that you're the pilot. And it sounded really nice on Facebook, but is that not exactly the same thing that James is talking about right here?
It's setting ourselves up to be God.
That's right. The assumption that you're in control, that you determine what happens today, tomorrow, and the rest of your life. That's right. It's very picturesque to put it that way. You're the pilot, but really it's just a veneer for the kind of pride that James is addressing right here. Or I saw a bumper sticker one time. Maybe you've seen this too, where it said, "God is my co-pilot."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So interesting. The assumption that I'm the pilot and God is my assistant. Again, just that's so much the American worldview, that we are in control of ourselves. We're in control of our futures. Now, what does James have to say about that attitude in verse 14?
Life is fragile and short, and you don't know what will happen tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
You are a wisp of steam or a smoke or vapor, visible for a bit and then leaving.
That's right. So how much difference is there between the control you think you have and the control that you actually have? Well, according to James, it's night and day. It's totally different. You can make plans for tomorrow, but you have no idea what will actually happen. You could, no, it's not. You could die in your sleep, right? You could get in a car accident. You could trip over your cat and break your neck. All kinds of crazy things could happen to you before you even get out of here today. How permanent is your life? James says it's a mist that appears for a little while and vanishes. It's like, well, you know, like the fog in winter that's gone by lunchtime, or the smoke that just gets blown away by the wind, or your breath in the air on a cold day. When you breathe out on a cold day and you see your breath in the air, how much time do you spend pondering that mist that comes out? Like, not much, do you? Because it's gone like that. And James says that's what your life is like. It's gone in a snap. This is similar to the image he used back in chapter 1 to describe the rich, when he said they're like wildflowers that are here today and gone tomorrow. And how long, this is something too I've noticed people say a lot at funerals or when someone dies, and I understand why, but they say they'll never be forgotten.
That's not true.
How long does it take to be forgotten?
One generation.
Pretty much. Unless you're like famous and have a statue of yourself somewhere, it doesn't take very long before you're completely forgotten. Even if your name's in a genealogy. I mean,
or on a gravestone.
That's right. Your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren, they might see your name, but they have no idea who you are. Yeah. We're here today and gone tomorrow, and there's a certain kind of foolishness in presuming to be in control when we so clearly are not. I say clearly, but it's actually not clear to a lot of people, because pride feeds the illusion of being independent from God, of being able to make something of yourself where you will never be forgotten when the reality is that you will. That could be very depressing if you're not grounded in the gospel, to think life is short and I'll be forgotten in how long? Except that you're not forgotten by the God who owns you. He doesn't forget you, and that's what's most important. Now, on that note, what does James say our attitude should be instead in verse 15?
We should say, it is God's will we will live. If it's God's will, we will live and do this or that. Instead, we boast in our arrogant schemes, and all boasting is evil.
Yes. So we ought to acknowledge that all things fall under the control of God. That if he wills it, we live and we go wherever and do whatever. Now, what does he mean by that? I mean, does he mean that we should just tack on the words God willing every time we talk about our plans? Or is there something else going on? What do you think?
It has to do with an attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Like
I agree. What kind of attitude?
being humble.
Uh-huh.
And dependent.
Right.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. To go about with this assumption that we're sovereign is to adopt the attitude of the world. As if, you know, God is kind of tacked onto our plans, but we decide what we're going to do. We might profess Christ, but according to the things we're saying, we're living as functional atheists. If we're just doing our own thing without acknowledging that God's the one who's in control. So what James is getting at right here is a humility that comes with knowing who we are in relation to God and living it with the conscious acceptance of the fact that God is God and we are not. That not only what we will do tomorrow, but whether or not we will even be alive tomorrow is completely under the sovereign control of our God. Okay, now let me ask you practically, what would it look like to live with that kind of attitude? How would it make a difference in daily life for you?
Make plans but hold them loosely.
I'm not very good at that. I realized that this morning when my plans get interrupted, I get really touchy.
Yeah, I didn't say I was, I just say that's what.
Yeah, that you hold on to your plans loosely because God could change them in a snap. That's right. What else?
It should affect worry.
It should.
Because you cannot control tomorrow. God's in control of tomorrow. We spend a lot of our time worrying about tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow.
Yep.
I was gonna say I wouldn't worry about my kids as much.
Yeah. It isn't, I mean, underneath worry and anxiety, isn't there something that just says, if I had more control, everything would be okay? When really God is fully in control and, yeah.
I think it's difficult for a person who goes, okay, I need to get this done, this done. Okay, now, I need to get this done. You're trying to be a good organizer, and you've got to step back and go, oh, wait a second, it may not work out the way I wanted.
Yeah, yeah. And James, I mean, when he contrasts that kind of attitude with this attitude of just saying, well, I'm going to go where I want and do what I want whenever I want, those plans are arrogant. That boasting, it's interesting to me. He doesn't just say that boasting is foolish. He says that boasting is evil. It's like he's just pointing out that pride gets piled onto more pride, and pride is so destructive. The thing is, the attitude he's confronting takes for granted that we have knowledge we don't, we have control that we don't, we have a permanence that we don't, and all of that betrays a kind of dividedness in us. That we don't see ourselves for who we actually are, and we're thinking in a way that's contrary to reality. Dividedness might look benign on the surface, but it goes together with pride and idolatry, and all of that stuff is destructive. So James, I think what James is talking about right here is what John calls in 1 John the pride of life. It's this arrogant sense of self-sufficiency and self-importance that's characteristic of the world. That people not only leave God out of their planning, it's the essence of sin that they brag about it when they do. But the wisdom of the world would say, or, you know, while the wisdom of the world would say you're in control, the wisdom of God says you're not. And there's an appropriate humility that comes with living in the consciousness that he is God and you are not. Okay, now what does James add in verse 17?
It says if you know to do good and do not do it, it's a sin.
Yes. So this verse, well, he summarizes the fact that there's, in relation to this topic, there are sins of commission and sins of omission. So sin isn't just doing what we shouldn't, it's also not doing what we should. There's this historical confession of sin that comes from the Book of Common Prayer. Maybe you've heard it. It says, most merciful God, we confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed by what we have done and by what we have left undone. We have not loved you with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. Yeah, it's not just what you do, it's what you don't do, but you should. To know the good we should do, James says, and to leave it undone is itself a sin. Okay, now, does it seem like James just changed the subject right here? Like he just threw in a random thought about sins of omission that's completely unrelated to what he just said? Topically, it might look that way, but there's a then or a therefore right there that actually connects it to what he just said. So it's not unrelated. And it's interesting that James puts this verse right here in a context where he's talking less about your actions and more about your attitude. So let me ask you this. How do you get humility? Do you pray for it and wait for God to zap you?
Have children.
Big children. Have kids. That's right. Is humility something that happens to you, or is humility something you choose?
Yes.
Tell me what you mean.
Well, I think it's a combination of both. You know, we encounter situations where we make a choice to act in a more humble way or to react in a more negative way. And, you know, it's like sanctification. It's something that we grow into as long as we allow God to be in control of our actions and our reactions. But, you know, I'm using the word reaction negatively, you know, because that's how usually the negative response is usually a lashing out gut reaction.
Wouldn't that be the same as reaction versus response? I always think of that as, okay, response allows me to take a breath and direct it toward God, where my reaction is straight outward. And I gotta think about it. What response? Is it glorifying God, or am I glorifying myself?
The flesh or the spirit.
Yeah, war.
But we definitely won't want humility unless God's Spirit works that in us first. So He has to even give us the desire for it. And then I think when we have the desire to have that quality, just not to be humble, you know what I mean? Like we're like, I want to be humble, but I also don't want to go through what that means. That's when we pray and we're like, okay, God, I want your Spirit to work this in my life. I don't want to be humble, and what that means, I don't want to humble myself, but I want to humble myself. And then God can work that in us, and we can make a choice as the situations come up. And yeah, and like you said about having kids humbles you. I said just the other day, when you have kids, you either become more prideful and in control and dominant and exercise that on your children, or you choose to let it humble you and to let your children humble you, to listen to them and to hear what they have to say and to apologize to them and to, yeah, so you can let it humble you, or you can let it make you more dominant and more controlling and prideful.
I think the humility that we're talking about is simply making God your ruler. You're humble before God. And sometimes being humble to God will seem bold to other people. But it's just, and I don't have it like you should, but that's what you need. It's just to submit to God. That's all there is to humility. And if He humbles you, it's to make you more submissive to Him.
It's really simple and really hard at the same time, isn't it? And when you read through the list of the fruit of the Spirit, one of the fruits of the Spirit is gentleness, which is also translated meekness, which is humility. Humility is a fruit of the Spirit. So you're right, we have to, if we want Christ-like humility, we have to go to God for that. The Spirit, we talked about humility a few weeks ago, that there is a humility that the world has that is not what God is talking about in His Word. Who do we take our cues from when it comes to humility? Jesus. We always go back to Jesus to tell us what humility looks like. And He was defined by boldness and submission to His Father. And if that's where we go for humility, then of course it would be the Spirit of God that has to produce Christ-like humility in us. So there's a sense in which it's passive in that the Spirit does it to us. But you're right, then we turn around and make decisions. We make choices to pursue humility, which I think is why James includes this verse right here. If you know that you should choose humility, it's a sin not to. I mean, that's what James is saying. So choose humility. Not just humility, but I mean, this applies to all kinds of things, but in the context, choose to do things that are humble. Choose to humble yourself before God and before other people.
It's not one or the other.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. It goes
Because
together.
You humble yourself with other people.
That's right.
And you put others first. And you listen
Not quite yet. I'll come back to you in a
Okay.
second.
Okay, go
I mean,
ahead.
yeah, I mean, think about this for yourself. In the way that you think or talk or pray about yourself, your family, your achievements, your failures, your plans, your goals, is there humility that demonstrates a reliance on God and His wisdom and His sovereign power? And if not, how could you change it? How can you change the way you talk and think and pray? I noticed this a while back. So my dad and I had gone and planted our gardens. Well, we'd started planting our gardens. And then I went over to my parents for lunch. And when we sat down to lunch, my dad prayed that God would bless the potatoes and the peas and give us a good crop. And it sounded so funny to pray about the potatoes and the peas. Isn't that just a really mundane kind of thing? I mean, it's just the garden. But underneath that is a recognition that the only way we're gonna get a good crop is if God gives it to us, right? I mean, we can do everything right and get hailed in the middle of July. like God is the one who has to do that. Or, well, there's this verse in the Psalms that says, unless God builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. You make the choice to build the house, but you do it in the knowledge that if God doesn't supply what you need, it's never going to happen, because he can pull a house down in a second if he wants to. I was thinking about this the other day, just in the way when I drive. If I'm headed off on a long road trip, I always pray before I leave, because I've seen enough craziness on I-80 to know that, there's mortality right there. It's crazy. But the thing is, when I drive to Walmart, I don't bother. Now, the problem isn't that I don't pray about every single thing I do before I do it, as if it's an indication of pride that I don't pray before I go to the grocery store. That's not the issue. What I realized as I was thinking about it was, I pray about I-80 because it feels out of control. I don't pray when I go to Walmart because it feels like it's fully in control. When the reality is, you can get in a car accident in the Walmart parking lot, just like you can on I-80. It's not how often do we pray, but is there an assumption of control over certain things because they seem small or mundane, and we're just like, well, I just make this decision.
That's usually when you get hurt or something.
Right, like statistics, it's within 10 miles or something.
Yeah. Like, Lindsay was at camp and hurt a pop in her knee, and now she's got a cane or a walking stick and a splint on her knee, and it just like that. And when we're doing things that.
Well, now, wait a minute, you left out the part where she was acting like a teenager playing soccer. She wasn't just walking down the trail.
Well, it changes after 40,
I hope she watches the live stream and hears that.
The point is, it happens in everyday little things that we do.
That's right.
I have to interact. Yesterday we went to the movie, Sound of Freedom, and I left my heart was hurting. Got in the car and turned the car on, looked behind me, and there was a car coming. And, it went by, and so I started to pull out, and he was right there coming. I must have missed that just by a hair. And I just stopped, told Tony, he said, just got to stop and just thank God that he is in control, no matter what this movie says. We've got to rely on him. And that little incident, I keep thinking about that, how, oh man, I could not be here today because I smashed the car, or this happened, or this happened. But it was such a beautiful illustration to me. Get your eyes off what the world says and put it on me. And so I'm here today.
Yeah. And again, it's not tacking God willing onto everything, although that might be helpful. It might be a good reminder. But it's the attitude of your heart, like the attitude that says God's in control and I'm not. How can you pursue humility just in the way that you think and talk and pray about the things of everyday life? Because it is a pursuit. It's both praying and asking God to give it to you and pursuing it in the choices that you make. Okay, Donna, change the subject.
The sins of commission and omission. And I was just thinking the sin of omission. Like it says, seeing something that if anyone knows the good they ought to do and don't do it, like like James 2, I think, verse something. It says you see a wealthy man with gold and you know, la-di-da, and then you see a poor man with filthy rags on and you ignore them or something. And it's just that sin of omission is pretty prevalent and prideful and not humble and just, yeah.
And it's a high standard. It's like, I mean, the Bible just kind of ratchets up
Yeah.
the standard of what it means to be remade in the character of God. It's not just that you don't do stuff you shouldn't, it's that you do all the things you should.
All the things you
I don't think I did that this morning, you know? You know, there's just always good to be done that you kind of think, well, I'll do that later. Yeah, it's a
Well,
high
you see a
standard.
homeless person and they're asking for money.
Well, and what's the right thing to do in that situation, you know?
You've opened that can of worms again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the,
Long discussion
yeah,
about that.
Here we go.
but it's that idea of, you know, are there good things that I know I should be doing and I'm not? Because I'd rather be in control than to let God say, okay, maybe it's time to stop your plan right here and deal with this other thing, or walk in this good work, do this thing for someone else. Yeah. Whew, James has got our number, doesn't he?
Yeah.
All right, how does chapter 5 begin in verse 1?
Begins like a good preacher. Now listen.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yep,
I say again, listen to this.
yep, pay attention. And then what?
We've been well.
Who?
Ye rich people.
Yes.
Not all rich people. Arrogant, rich, sinful, prideful,
Yes.
selfish,
I-
abusive.
I think that's right, because he says because of the misery that's coming on you. That's a cheerful way to start the last chapter, isn't it? He's not pulling any punches, this is serious, and he's not changing the subject. Because his argument about humility and doing good leads logically to an issue he's already addressed, which is money. So he's working out the practical implications of that argument, and those implications confront sin in the strongest way possible. This is one of the sternest warnings in the Bible about wealth. It goes right along with some of the warnings from the Old Testament prophets. So he's back to this topic of the rich and the poor. Now, I agree, in the context, I think he is actually talking primarily to unbelievers right here, because of the things that he says as we go through it, that there's judgment coming on them, and it's going to be destructive judgment. Now, here's the thing. Why would he address unbelieving rich people right here, if they're not primarily the ones who were listening? Well, this kind of thing happens in the oracles of judgment in the Old Testament, too, where you see the prophets addressing people who aren't there. It's actually a literary feature called apostrophe, where you address somebody in your argument who isn't actually there, but you're doing it for the benefit of the people who are listening. So, I mean, think about if you heard a politician and he's given a speech and he says, so-and-so better watch out when November comes. And his political rival that he's talking to isn't there. But what's he saying when he says, you better watch out? He's giving this challenge to someone who's not there for the benefit of all his supporters who are sitting there listening, right? And James and the prophets do something similar. So here, what's the point of warning people who aren't there? Well, first, to encourage the faithful that God's justice will prevail, which is what he's going to get to in just a second. And also, I think, to warn those of God's people who might be tempted to envy the wealthy, or to trust them, or to commit the same sins that they are. James is talking about people who are oppressing the poor in order to encourage his readers who are oppressed. We'll talk more about that next week too. And also, I think, to preemptively warn any of the wealthy people in the church who might be tempted to take their cues on money from the world instead of from God. So, that designation, you rich, essentially means the unrighteous rich. Although, of course, we know from the warning of Jesus, it's hard for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. So there is a warning here for anybody who has money, because money is a temptation. It tends to tempt people toward autonomy. Okay, now why is misery coming on the rich, the unrighteous rich, in verses 2 and 3?
silver and gold are corroded, and your wealth is rotted, the moths have eaten your clothes. I mean, it's all, it's,
So it's not, misery isn't coming, judgment isn't coming because it's inherently evil to be wealthy. It's coming because certain of the rich are misusing their wealth. Now, of course, money can be used for good and godly purposes, but that's not what's happening right here. James says their wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten their clothes, and their gold and silver are corroded. That corrosion, he says, is going to testify against them and eat their flesh like fire. Whew. And they're in the last days, and they've laid up all this treasure for themselves. They've hoarded their wealth. So the problem isn't being wealthy, the problem is hoarding it. The fact that they're hoarding their money. Now let's talk about that for a minute. What's the difference? Is there a difference between saving and hoarding? And why is hoarding a bad thing?
It's refusing to trust God. It's not having your wealth in submission to God.
Right.
So you can say, God, do you want me to save? Okay, I'll save. Or you can say, I need to protect myself because I'm hedging my bets.
That's right. That's why you hoard, isn't it? Is because you find some kind of security or safety in just accumulating more and more stuff for yourself. When you save money, well, you can save money for the wrong reasons, but you're putting it aside for a future use. But when you hoard money, you're trying to protect yourself. And there's that parable in Luke 12 where Jesus describes the same thing, the rich man who has more than he can store in his barns. So with all the extra, what does he decide to do? Give it away? Sell it? What does he do with it? He builds bigger barns. Why in the world would you just build bigger barns to just keep more of it for yourself? Because it makes you feel safe. It makes you feel secure. And you remember what happens to that guy? He does. Jesus says that same night, God demands his life from him. Your wealth can protect you from all kinds of stuff, but it can't protect you from God. And that's the most important thing. It doesn't ultimately give you security or safety.
It also puffs you up.
It does. Pride and wealth often go together. Yep. And not only can wealth not preserve people, it can't even preserve itself. I mean, James says all the riches they're hoarded, that they've hoarded are being eaten away by rot and corrosion and moths. And not only does the decay destroy what the people have, but it testifies against them. What does that mean? How does all that decay and rot of their wealth testify against them?
Shows what they cared about.
Mm-hmm.
Shows their idols.
Yeah, that's right. It's clear evidence of their greed and their selfishness. So instead of making them safer, their wealth brings trouble and misery onto them. Temporarily or permanently? Right here, it's permanently, because their refusal to use it rightly will condemn them when the day of God's judgment comes. So wealth should be used for the benefit of people to further God's kingdom, and all the more so if the days are short and judgment is near. But when the judgment comes, the rich are going to go the way of their wealth, he says, consumed by fire, because they trusted in their riches instead of trusting in God. And unlike earthly courts, the court of God, there's no bribery. Your wealth isn't going to get you anywhere in the court of God. Now, I don't think the wealthy that James is talking about here, when I read this, I always think of this big vault where they're piling up gold coins like Scrooge McDuck. That's what I think of. I don't think that's what they're doing, and I don't think also that they're walking around in moth-eaten clothes. Silver and gold don't actually corrode. It's not that James is literally seeing their wealth rot, but he's using this figurative language to condemn their hoarding. But if that's the case, what is the actual evidence that they're hoarding their money? What's the basis for these accusations that he's making? And that's where he goes next. What are they doing in verses 4 to 6?
They're oppressing people with their wealth.
Uh-huh.
They're not paying people who work for them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're not paying their workers, and here's the evidence of their hoarding. They've hired people to work in their fields, but they're defrauding them by holding their wages. Now, for the Jews, that was a very clear violation of the Old Testament law. But because of the power and position that rich people had, they could get away with it, and no one held them accountable. And the hired workers couldn't do anything about it. So let me read for you a bit of background, because this is relevant not just to James, but to some of the things that Jesus talks about too. The circumstances pictured by James are very much true to life at that time. So in the first century, there was increasing concentration of land in the hands of a small group of very wealthy landowners. And as a result, the holdings of many farmers were assimilated into these large estates, and the farmers were forced to earn their living by hiring themselves out to rich landlords. Jesus' parable about the workers in the vineyard, which is in Matthew 20, makes use of this familiar background, and it's significant that the workers expect their pay at the end of the day. In fact, this was commanded in the law. This is from Deuteronomy 24. He says, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy. Whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner, pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin." Those kinds of warnings are found elsewhere, in Leviticus and Malachi, for example, where defrauding laborers of their wages is associated with oppression of the widows and the orphans, which James has mentioned before. This connects back to that whole idea of religion that's worthless or not, sins of omission and sins of commission. Prompt payment would have been very important for a day laborer who often got by at a barely subsistence level and who needed a steady income to provide daily bread for himself and his family. In a society where credit was not readily available, the failure to pay workers promptly could jeopardize their lives, because starvation was a very real thing. So this is a very serious situation where it's not just an employer saying, wait till the end of the month and it'll all be fine. It's an employer who's wealthy, who has the means to pay his workers, and he's not when he knows they need it. And there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, no one can hold the rich accountable. Well, I say that no one can, but that's not strictly true, because what does James say right here about that, about the rich and what they're doing? Will someone hold them accountable? Who will it be? Did you notice what it called him right here? The Lord Almighty, or the Lord of hosts, your translation might say, which is the Lord of all the armies of heaven. Why do you think James called the Lord that right here?
To stress how powerful he is,
And why does that matter in the context?
because he's the ultimate judge.
That's right. They're not getting away with it. The Almighty God, the Lord of the armies of heaven, he sees what's happening, and he can absolutely hold people accountable, and he will. Because of his sovereign power, he will bring justice to bear on this situation, and he will right the wrongs. And it's not like the landowners have a legitimate reason to not pay their workers, like they're just momentarily short of funds or something. They don't have a good reason, and it's clear that they don't, because what are they doing in the meantime? How are they living?
In luxury.
Yep, luxury and self-indulgence. They're underpaying their workers while they themselves are overfed. And then he adds this really interesting image in verse 5. What does he say?
Fix themselves up.
For,
They slaughter.
why do you think he says it like that? What's he getting at when he says that?
Eternal life.
And what's coming for them?
Separation from God.
Yeah, and this picture of fattening themselves up for the day of slaughter, it's really interesting. If you're gonna slaughter cattle for food, which ones would you typically take first? The fat ones, right? Because they're the ones who've obviously been eating well. And so there's this picture that, you know, if the day of, their self-indulgence is going to be clearly evident, and it's going to testify against them. I mean, and if the day of slaughter sounds a bit over the top, it's not, because James says again in verse 6, this is a very serious issue. They've condemned and murdered righteous people who were not opposing them. That might be because the rich are setting people up in court, or it might be a figurative way of saying withholding their wages is a matter of life and death, because starvation really is a possibility. But whatever the case is, the rich here cannot claim some sort of, self-defense where I just didn't have money today. Well, if you're fattening yourself up, you do have the money. And the fact that they're doing that will demonstrate that they deserve the judgment that they get. This whole situation is just the height of injustice, and God will judge them for what they're doing.
So much of it is comforting and reminiscent of God telling these people, I have heard your cries in Egypt. I have heard the cries, which is comforting even though it was hundreds of years. To know that God heard those cries. So when we see injustice, such as in the movie, or child abuse, whatever we see that is a terrible injustice that hurts us to our soul, you know, that hurts God more. And he's listening to those cries and he's storing up for judgment.
Yes.
We would like judgment right now, punishment. We'd like to see those people cut up and suffer. But it's comforting to know that God is hearing those cries, the cries of those children.
Yep.
And he will going to be one day cut up and fattened those people. So there's a lot of comfort in that, harkening back to Egypt through today.
Yeah.
We have to take comfort that God hears the cries of his people, and he will respond.
Yes. Which I think is the point of this passage. Again, he's warning people who aren't there. But why is he warning the people who aren't there? For the comfort of the people who are, which is the believers, and in particular, believers who are in situations where they're being oppressed. And the thing is, you think about all the times in the Bible where it says, don't take vengeance yourself, but leave it to the Lord. The only way you can do that is if you know the judge of all the earth will do right. You have to know that justice is coming, and that God will bring perfect justice, to be able to let go of it yourself and to say, okay, I'm going to love my enemies. I'm going to love people that I don't want to love. I'm going to love people who are hurting me even, because I don't have to bring justice about in this situation. Now that doesn't mean we don't pursue justice when we can. Of course we should. But you're going to encounter situations where you can't bring justice about. Nobody else can either, but God can. And you're right, that should be a huge comfort to God's people, to know that I don't have to make this right. God will make it right. I'll do what I can, but God's the one who ultimately will right the wrongs, and he will. None of that gets by him. All that oppression, none of it gets by God. He will right the wrongs.
And he knows more so what real justice looks like too, I think. Because we think that justice has to turn out a certain way, and that it has to be pain or like, flogging or, whatever it is, but, or, whatever they're doing to their victim, should be brought back on their own heads. But when we look through God's eyes, we see too that sin, letting someone continue in sin, and letting someone's heart be hardened to the God who is the author of life and who is the only one who gives goodness in life. Sometimes that hardening and that letting someone just continue in their sin is God's justice. Because that is the worst thing that we can experience, is living a life that's separated from God. And for the victims of this, good is often, it's always what God brings from it. And it's that nearness to him. It's not living an easy life, or never having to deal with pain, or never being oppressed. That's not our ultimate good. And nearness to God is that good. And so we, even in those situations of horror, are even experiencing God's justice there, of that closeness to him, which is that reward, and the person who is continuing in that darkness and having their soul eaten away. That's part of God's justice too. It's not the ultimate justice with heaven and hell, but it's there.
I was thinking that rich people have a certain comfort, and just knowing that things are okay, and I'm driving this nice car, and I'm living in this nice house, and everything's okay. And then I always kind of look at things this way from college, and it was in psychology, and they have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is anybody familiar with that? Yeah. And at the very top of the triangle is self-actualization and transcendence, whatever that means. And then at the bottom of the triangle, which you have to accomplish the bottom to get to the next level, and then that level to get to this level in your life, your whatever. And anyway, so at the bottom is physiological needs like house, food, warmth when it's cold, you know, those sorts of things at the very bottom before you can go on to the next level. And poor people have trouble just with that bottom level, you know. And anyway, it's just something I think about when I think of life and all of it, you know, how the struggle, I guess, for people with very little, you know.
And when you were saying that, it made me think of one of the Proverbs, I think it's in the Proverbs or Psalms, where he says, the writer says, don't give me too much or too little. You know, don't make me too wealthy or too poor, because there's a temptation in both of those to either turn away from God or to abandon him. That's, I mean, yeah, like extreme poverty or extreme wealth, both of those bring with them a temptation to turn away from God.
And Paul says himself, and I'm trying to remember where it is, but he said, for your sake we were afflicted, and we were poor, and we were destitute, and Paul had a whole lot of self-actualization. You know, he had that peak, and the apostles and the people who are in God's will for them, you know, seeking God's will and doing whatever that is, he said, I've learned to be content in all circumstances. And so we don't have to have the things that the world says we need in order to have God's good. And it makes sense why that, you know, that pyramid, because you see it in psychology, but God also works beyond that. And you can be in a destitute situation. You think of our brothers and sisters who are persecuted around the world.
Right.
And I heard a story of a woman who was locked in a shipping container for over a year and beaten all the time because she would not give up Christ. And yet, this woman had joy because the Holy Spirit gave her joy. Yeah, you know, it's God's wisdom transcends the wisdom of the world.
Well, and you could put up there your own little God's wisdom, or, you know, at being at peace with God, being at the top of that triangle.
Or the bottom. If it's
Yeah.
all based on that.
Yeah.
If it's all based on that,
Yeah.
it should be the foundation.
I don't know why I brought that up.
Well, and the thing is, if
It's talked about.
if you want an example of how to walk through poverty, oppression, really difficult circumstances, where do we get our cues? Jesus, always. I mean, isn't it significant that when our God became a human being, he didn't live a charmed life, and he wasn't wealthy, and he experienced oppression? He has shown us in his example how to walk through that in a way that pleases God. And yeah, sometimes I think, well, you know, God, he's all powerful. Where does he take his own medicine? In the incarnation, that's where he's experienced the kind of suffering we have, and he's the example. Yeah. And how does God, I mean, how does Jesus put aside, how does he go through all that injustice that he goes through and have humility and meekness in the middle of all that? Because he trusts his Father to take care of him. He trusts his Father to enact justice at the right time. He trusts the agenda of the Father. And he doesn't have to get himself out of this situation. He can just trust his Father. Yeah, Jesus
That
gives us the key.
Also shows compassion. Christ shows compassion to others.
Yep.
And these people who are oppressing the poor have no compassion for their situation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And all of that, I mean, all of that's connected to what James was saying before, because what's the current that's running underneath all of this hoarding and defrauding? It's pride. I mean, there's again, assumption of control, that you're accountable to nobody, that you're the master of your fate, you're the captain of your soul. You can do what you like to whoever you like, and there's no accountability. But there is, and the Lord will bring justice.
I heard just the other day, and it really made me think, you've heard of righteous anger? And I kind of bit onto that. Well, it's righteous anger, so it's okay. Until I realized we have no righteous anger. If we had righteous anger, why did God tell us not to go to bed with anger, you know, and only Christ was the, only Christ could have that. We have no business. Now, I can't even explain it. It was so good. It was, I feasted on it and feasted on it, and now I can't even explain it. But it just really opened my eyes how that is pride. And I hear so much of it. I do hear it from Christians who say, yes, but it's okay because it's righteous anger to feel that way. No, it's not.
Well, it's,
No.
isn't it like blessed are the poor in spirit, and the whole Sermon on the Mount where he's like, those that hunger and thirst for righteousness. So you're hungering and thirsting for God's ultimate righteousness and justice, not this self-fulfilling anger that you were done wrong.
Yeah,
But it's the righteous anger was more for the sake of others. I thought that's what I
And
think
yet
we're
that,
going with that.
yeah, and yet that also has to be in humility and submission to God, and say, God, I give over my vengeful thoughts here, because your will is your will, and I'm okay with whatever happens.
Well, right, and that
Yeah.
righteous anger might prompt you into, you know, the rescue of, you know, kids that are being trafficked. I mean, I think there is that. I think God uses it in people.
But when we say, well,
For a
I can
cause
hold
bigger
on to
than
this because it's
ourselves.
righteous anger, I think
No,
that's where
that's-
you have to say,
Well, like I'm
we
hearing
have to
it.
go to, and what made me think of this was when Christ went to his Father. When you explained that about the Father. And that's what we have to do. Father, I give this anger, my child died because somebody killed him, or my child was raped because of this or that. And it's like, no, God, I gotta come to you just as Christ did. They took his life. Did he say, that's righteous anger, you
He
know?
said, forgive them.
Forgive them. And so what God did, God's gonna do something in all that, so, yeah.
No, it's, you know, there's a point where anger is right, because God gets angry. So we know there is anger that's right. You see Jesus get angry, but what does he get angry about? Does he get angry that people made him look bad?
The love of money.
He
In the
gets
temple.
angry because people are blaspheming God by what they're doing at the temple. Like that's the kind of stuff that makes Jesus angry. And he gets angry because of the way people are treating his Father's house. I get angry because people say stuff that makes me look bad. Like, and that's the thing, is there's a right anger, but how long can you hang on to it before it becomes something that's not right anymore? There's a fine line between that kind of anger and pride, because pride tends to take over anger really quickly.
And I think about that movie last night. Yeah, they presented the whole thing, but it left you hurting, empty, and when it comes to God's word, it's the opposite. And I'm so thankful that I almost hit the guy. I'm so thankful for it because it went, wake up, Susan, wake up. I'm in control. Not this movie, not everything else. I'm in control. I'm so thankful for that. Also thankful I didn't
Well,
hit
in
the
that
car.
scripture you read too. Kind of,
In
they
the-
put
Put on this morning, yeah, I had to go, I woke up this morning and I was just, I thought, why am I so, where's my joy? And I had to run back to my James. I sat in the bathtub this morning and just read James and then read that scripture, but yeah, I had to get back into the Word.
I don't want to get off on that movie too much, but I didn't realize that they also use those children for organ donation and their blood and things like that, and their genitalia in some cultures. It's really bad.
Well, that
There's
James,
so much more to it than just the sex part.
I do like, I see the parallels in James 5 with James 3:16, because it's where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. And so it's yes, it's the wretched also the super rich that think they're getting away with everything, and it's really this evil and disorder, and it's vile.
It says demonic.
And the thing is, anger is, even in the Bible, anger isn't the last word. Anger always pursuing his justice, I'm pursuing good things. Or is this the kind of anger where I'm just irritated and upset with people and I feel like I can nurse this and it's okay?
What he said to love your enemy.
Yeah, it takes some wisdom to know that. Yeah. All right, any last comments? Anything you want to add?
I just think we need to also remember through prayer that God is oftentimes, and this is more what I took away from the movie than it was disturbing and awful, is God's calling his people to action. One more time, be aware of this, take action, work on legislation, do what you can to prevent this horrible evil that I have presented. Because these films were created by mostly Christian folks, and I say there's a call to action, rather than something that should make me very sad and depressed, which it is. It's so disturbing. It's truth. It's what's around us. And I think, I'm not criticizing you because you and I know each other too well. I think oftentimes the church likes to do this and be asleep because it is disturbing. But I don't think we have to go around being so angry that it ruins our life and takes our joy away from the Lord. But we are called to action. I think so much of what's happened in our world today that we see consequences of divorce, consequences of abortion, child trafficking, false prophecy comes from so often the church was just like this, and asleep. And God calls us to action and to wake up and call upon him to guide us into action and trust that he can steer the ship.
Well, another thing I kept thinking during this movie is, oh my goodness, we dress our little babies up for dance, making them look like these adult women, and then they dance in this provocative way, and we, yay, we clap and everything, and that was something that really bothered me.
And I think it's
You
a
know,
way
they don't
of
do the polka, they do all this other stuff.
Animation, yeah. But I
I
think
just
as a
think we
church
have to
we
be
go,
aware
oh,
of
but it's so
Christians to
cute.
continue to pray and ask God, what can I do?
Well,
What
we were
can I
asleep
do?
during Holocaust, you know,
Yeah.
when all of that was happening. I listened to the man that starred in this movie talk. You know, I listened to several talks that he's given. I hadn't seen the movie, but anyway, he said that we were asleep during Holocaust. We didn't do anything. We didn't make a move, and now 50 years later, we make Schindler's List. You know, and then everybody is conscious of what happened 50 years ago. You know, and he said other things that have happened too. You know, in the last years that we kind of are asleep.
But our joy has remained in the Lord and our faith has remained in the Lord. And there's a reason for perhaps this movie to be brought to our attention. Because it may call some people, not you necessarily, not me, to get out and take action, donate money, legislate, whatever it is. But to pray for those people. And I think it's always a call to prayer in reality soon.
But the verse that I
joy.
said this morning was, but I will sing of your strength. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love in the morning. For you have been to me a fortress and a refuge in the day of my distress.
That's so encouraging. It's a great reminder.
Humility is really important in that situation, isn't it? Because if you come to that kind of evil thinking, I have to do something about this, you should do something about it because you belong to God. I mean, that's good, you know? That's good. But if you feel like you're the one who has to sort this out, like you're the one who's in control, it's going to crush you. It's not just this issue. I mean, that's any kind of issue. There's an important humility in being able to say, God is God and I am not. And I'm going to do what he calls me to do, but he's the one who solves this problem. Because otherwise, how do you go to sleep at night?
There's
You
way
know?
too many things for us to try to control. And
That's right. That's right.
But we can answer his call specifically for
That's
each of
right.
us.
Yeah.
Everybody does a little bit.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, we'll stop there. All right, things to pray about.